The folded blanket lay in the corner of the small room, the same one my daughter once used when she stayed here. Now it rested neatly on the dog's bed. A soft cushion for the only heart in this house that still beats for me without condition. I stood in the doorway, my hand on the frame, and wondered how a space once filled with her laughter could be claimed by silence so quickly. Love, I've learned, can be taken away without warning, and without reason. My house is not large, never was, but it has always been enough for me. A white clapboard home on a quiet street, the kind where the mailman still greets you by name, and the sound of church bells marks the hour on Sundays. The front porch sags a little now, but the swing still creaks the same as it did when my husband, Walter, first hung it 45 years ago. I still sit there on spring evenings, watching the shadows grow long across the yard, remembering the years when this home was full in a way it no longer is. I am 78 this year. My knees remind me of it every time I climb the porch steps, and the calendar on the wall confirms it when I stop pretending I've forgotten the date. The mornings come early for me now, a habit I've kept from when Walter would rise before dawn for work. He's been gone for 16 years. Some days it feels like yesterday I lost him. Other days it feels like I've been carrying the weight of that absence for a lifetime. My daughter Claire was my only child. She came into the world on a cold January morning, her cheeks red and her cries sharp enough to shake me from every fear I'd carried through pregnancy. She was my joy, my purpose. I built my days around her. Her lunchbox in the morning, her bedtime stories at night. Walter and I worked hard, not just for a roof and food on the table, but to give her a life that felt safe, steady. When Walter passed, Claire was 35. She was the one who held my hand at the funeral, the one who told me we'd get through it together. And we did for a time. She'd come over after work, her voice filling the kitchen as she told me about her day. We'd sit at the table long after the dishes were done, drinking tea and talking about everything from bills to memories of Walter. It was around then that I got the dog Max, a rescue with soft brown eyes and a tail that wagged even when life gave him little reason. Claire laughed the first time she saw him, said he looked like he'd been through as much as I had. She brought him treats, scratched behind his ears, and told me he was good for me. And he was. For years the spare room was hers. Not just a guest room, hers. I kept it ready, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed, a lamp on the nightstand, a small vase for the flowers she sometimes brought. Even after she got her own apartment, she'd stay here on weekends now and then. We'd watch movies, Max curled between us on the couch. I liked those nights, the easy closeness, the way it felt like nothing had really changed since she was a girl. But things did change. They always do. Though sometimes so slowly you don't notice until it's already happened. The phone calls became shorter. Visits less frequent. At first I thought it was just the busyness of her life, work, friends, commitments. I told myself not to be selfish, not to cling. Still, I found myself looking out the window when I heard a car slow on the street, hoping it was hers. The holidays became smaller too. One Thanksgiving, she brought a store-bought pie instead of making the pumpkin one we always made together. "It's easier this way," she said, her eyes on her phone as she spoke. I told her it was fine, and maybe it was. But I missed the smell of cinnamon and the sound of her laugh as we worked side by side in the kitchen. Then there were the little things, so small they might have seemed silly to anyone else. The way she'd scroll through her phone while I talked, nodding without looking at me. The way she started calling less on my birthday, sometimes just sending a text instead. The way she began saying she was too tired to come by, even when I'd made her favorite soup. It wasn't one moment that told me something had shifted. It was the quiet accumulation of 100 small distances. Like the way winter snow piles up one flake at a time until, before you know it, you're trapped behind a wall you never saw building. Still, I kept the room ready. Just in case. Just in hope. The town around me went on as it always had. The hardware store still put out pumpkins in October. The diner still served coffee so strong it could keep you awake until morning. Neighbors still waved from their porches when I passed with Max. But inside my house something was fading. I tried to keep busy. I baked bread for the church bake sale. I volunteered to read at the library's children's hour. I took Max on long walks through the park, letting him sniff every tree and post as if it were the most important task in the world. And still, the emptiness settled in. Especially in the evenings when the light turned gold and the shadows stretched across the living room. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being unseen. You can be sitting across the table from someone and still feel as if you've been erased. I didn't want to believe that's what was happening with Claire. I told myself it was just a season, that she'd come back, the way she always had before. But the truth is, even before the words were spoken, I think I knew. I think some part of me felt the door closing long before it shut completely. For now, I kept my rituals: fresh flowers on the kitchen table, a candle in the window on winter nights, the spare bed made up with the quilt she liked. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was hope. But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. It started with little changes, so small I told myself they didn't matter. But little changes, if you're not careful, can pile up like dust in the corners of a house, until one day you notice the air feels heavy. Claire began stopping by less often. She'd call on her way somewhere else, the conversation quick, her words clipped. She'd tell me she was just checking in. But it didn't feel like checking in, more like checking a box. Sometimes I'd be in the middle of answering her question and I'd hear the faint clicking of her keyboard in the background, the sound of her attention somewhere else entirely. One Sunday afternoon she came by after a family brunch. She didn't ask me to come. She didn't even mention it until she was standing in my kitchen, setting down a half-eaten pastry wrapped in a napkin. "I thought you might want this," she said, sliding it onto the counter without looking up. The pastry was cold. So was her voice. Holidays became the clearest marker of the shift. That first Christmas she skipped, she told me she was too tired from traveling with friends. I sat at the table that morning with Max at my feet, the radio playing faint carols, a plate of cinnamon rolls untouched. The house was dressed in garlands and warm light, but it felt hollow. I told myself she'd make it next year. When she did come for Thanksgiving, she arrived late, her arms full of grocery bags from the store. She'd bought everything pre-made: turkey slices, gravy in a jar, pies in their plastic containers. "This will make it easier for you," she said, smiling faintly, as if she were doing me a kindness. I nodded, thanked her, and pulled out plates. But the kitchen felt colder without the smell of roasting turkey, without the sound of us working side by side. There were other moments, smaller but somehow sharper. Once we were at a cousin's barbecue. I went to join a group of them talking in the shade, only to hear my name drop into a sentence before the conversation went quiet. They all smiled politely when I approached, but the warmth felt forced, like they were covering something. Claire barely met my eyes, her smile thin, her body angled away. Another time, I offered to help with her apartment while she was away for work. I thought I'd water her plants, maybe tidy up. She hesitated before saying she'd already asked a friend. I brushed it off, but something in her tone made it clear. She didn't want me there. It was in those small silences, those closed doors, that I felt it most. The way her hand didn't linger when we hugged goodbye. The way she stopped telling me about the little things in her life. The books she was reading, the coworkers she liked. Our conversations became stripped of color, reduced to logistics. When she might stop by, what errands she needed to run, the occasional comment about the weather. Even the spare room began to feel wrong. She used it less and less, until months would go by without her staying over. I'd still keep it ready, the bed smoothed, the lamp dusted. But it began to look more like a photograph than a living space. Neat, untouched, waiting for someone who might never come. Max noticed too. Dogs always do. When she came by, he'd run to her, tail wagging. But instead of kneeling down to greet him, she'd pat his head briefly, already halfway through the kitchen to put her bag down. He'd look at me after she passed, confused, as if asking whether he'd done something wrong. The moments that hurt most were the ones where I felt invisible in my own home. She'd come over, sit at the table scrolling on her phone, responding to my questions with short answers. Sometimes I'd try to tell her a story from my day, something about a neighbor or a recipe I tried, and halfway through she'd stand up to get water, or check her bag or take a call. It wasn't cruelty. Not in the way people think of cruelty. It was something quieter, something harder to name. An erosion. A slow pulling away, like the tide slipping back from the shore, leaving the sand cold and bare. I tried to tell myself it was just how things go. Children grow up, their lives fill with other people, other responsibilities. But this felt different. This felt like being moved from the center to the edge, like my place in her life was being trimmed down, little by little, until one day there might be nothing left at all. There were nights I'd lie awake, listening to Max breathing softly at the foot of my bed, and think of the years when my world was so wrapped up in hers. I'd remember standing in the school auditorium, clapping until my hands stung after her first piano recital. I'd remember the way she'd sit at the kitchen table with her homework, asking for help, her brow furrowed in concentration. Those memories still lived in me, but I began to wonder if they lived in her anymore. I didn't cry much then, not yet. It wasn't a grief that came all at once. It was a slow grief, like the fading of a photograph left too long in the sun. Each small moment took away a little more color. I still hoped. Hope is stubborn like that. Even when it has been worn thin, it clings to the edges, whispering that things might change, that maybe this distance is just a phase. But deep down I felt the air shifting. The room that had once been hers felt heavier now, as though it were holding all the things unsaid between us. And I knew, though I wouldn't let myself say it aloud, that something in the way she saw me had already changed. It was a late afternoon in early autumn, the kind where the light is gold and thin, and the air carries the first bite of the coming cold. I had been in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie I thought I might take to the church bake sale. Max was lying at my feet, his tail thumping every so often against the floorboards. I wasn't expecting her that day. Claire didn't come by unannounced anymore. But I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, and before I could stop it, my heart gave that familiar leap. I wiped my hands on my apron, smoothed my hair back, and opened the door. She didn't smile when she saw me. There was a stiffness in her shoulders, a way her eyes slid past mine and into the house as if she were looking for something else entirely. She stepped inside without removing her coat, set her purse on the counter, and crossed her arms. I asked if she was all right, if something had happened. She nodded once, though it was not the kind of nod that answers anything. Her gaze was sharp, almost businesslike, and in that moment I had the strange sense of standing in my own home as a guest. She spoke quickly, her words stacked and certain. She said she had been thinking that things between us had changed. She said she didn't feel like we were family anymore. The sentence landed quietly, without emphasis, but it might as well have been shouted. The sound of it seemed to echo in the space between us. I felt it in my chest first, like something had been knocked loose, and then in my hands, which trembled just enough for me to notice. I didn't ask her what she meant. Some words don't need unpacking. They are whole in themselves, heavy enough to crush without explanation. I stood there, the apple peeler still in my hand, and looked at her, really looked. She seemed older than I remembered, more guarded, as though she had built walls in places I could no longer reach. She went on, speaking of changes in her life, of needing space, of things being different now. Her voice was calm, measured. There was no anger in it, only finality. I nodded when she paused, though my throat felt too tight to speak. In my mind I saw all the years lined up. The birthday cakes, the scraped knees, the late-night talks, the mornings I packed her lunches, the nights I sat up waiting for her to come home safe. I saw Walter smiling down at her when she was just a baby, his hand resting gently on her back. And I wondered how all of that could be folded away so neatly in her mind, set aside as if it were no longer part of the present. Max rose from his spot on the floor and padded over to her, tail wagging, looking up at her with eyes full of hope. She reached down and patted his head once, without looking at him, and then straightened her coat. She said she had to go, that she just wanted to tell me in person. When the door closed behind her, the silence in the house was unlike any silence I'd ever known. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room, or of an evening alone. It was the quiet of something ending. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed my hands flat against its surface, as if to steady myself. My eyes fell on the bowl of apples, their skin smooth and red in the fading light. I had been preparing something sweet, but now the very thought of it turned heavy in my stomach. I stayed there a long while, listening to the small sounds of the house, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of the porch boards settling in the cool air. Max lay at my feet again, pressing against me as if he knew I needed the weight of him there. I didn't cry. Not right away. The tears came later, in the middle of the night, when I woke to the sound of rain against the windows and realized that my life had tilted in a way I could not undo. There is a kind of betrayal that is sharp, loud, and unmistakable, like a door slammed in your face. This was not that. This was quieter but somehow deeper. It was the slow withdrawal of warmth from a room, the way the air changes when a storm moves in. I thought of all the times I had waited by the window for her to arrive. The meals I had made, the bed I had kept ready, the stories I had saved to tell her. I thought of how easily she had stood there, in the kitchen where I had fed her for decades, and told me I was no longer part of her family. And then I thought of something my own mother once told me long ago, that love is a gift but not a guarantee. You can give it freely with your whole heart, and still find yourself standing alone at the end. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew that the room she once called hers no longer felt like hers at all. It felt like an echo, and echoes cannot be held. That night I walked down the hallway, paused in the doorway and looked at the neat bed, the folded quilt, the lamp waiting to be switched on. I reached for the lamp but didn't turn it on. Instead, I closed the door gently, as if I might keep the emptiness contained. In the dark with Max curled at my side, I realized that something in me had shifted. Not healed, not yet, but shifted. The breaking point had come. And though I didn't know it then, what would follow would not be a fight to win her back. It would be a quiet, steady fight to keep myself. The morning after she left, I woke to a house that felt both too big and too still. Sunlight stretched across the bedroom floor in narrow strips, catching the dust that floated in the air. Max was already awake, his head resting on my arm, his eyes fixed on me as if waiting for a signal, for the next thing to do. I lay there a while, listening to the hum of the heater, the faint ticking of the clock in the hall. My chest still felt heavy from the night before, but the sharpness of the hurt had dulled. In its place was something quieter, heavier but steadier, as if the ground beneath me, though cracked, had stopped shaking. For years I had lived in a kind of waiting. Waiting for her visits. Waiting for her calls. Waiting for the next time things might feel like they used to. That waiting had filled my days like water in a vase. Not alive but holding its shape. Now I saw that the vase was empty. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to set it down. I made coffee the way I always do, 2 scoops, water just shy of boiling. The slow pour that fills the kitchen with a deep earthy smell. I stood by the counter, sipping from my old ceramic mug, and looked toward the hallway. The door to the spare room was still closed from the night before. I could almost feel its presence, the way it held the words she had left behind. After breakfast, I walked down the hall and opened it. The air inside was cool, still scented faintly with the lavender sachet I kept in the dresser. The quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed, the lamp dustless and ready. Nothing was out of place, which only made the room feel more like a museum than a place someone might sleep. I stood there a long time, my hand resting on the doorframe. Then slowly I stepped inside. I didn't pack everything away all at once. That would have felt too much like erasing her. Instead, I started with the smallest things. A stack of old magazines on the nightstand gone. The hairbrush she'd left in the drawer years ago, placed in a box. The sweater draped over the back of the chair, folded, stored. With each small removal I felt a space open up. Not just in the room but inside me. It wasn't a space for her anymore. It was a space for me. Over the next few days I continued. I took the photos from the wall, wrapping each one in tissue paper and tucking them into a box marked with her name. I cleaned the windows until they shone. I dusted every surface. And then one morning I carried Max's bed into the room and set it down in the corner. At first he seemed unsure, sniffing around as if he knew this had been hers. But within minutes, he curled up on the bed, his eyes half closed, his breathing deep. I sat in the chair by the window and watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling in the sunlight. It was then that I realized this room no longer needed to be a place of waiting. It could be a place of comfort for me, for him. A place not tied to the hollow ache of someone's absence, but to the steady presence of someone who stayed. I didn't feel triumphant. This wasn't a victory. It was something quieter, a kind of acceptance. I couldn't make her see me as family again. I couldn't bring back the closeness we had lost. But I could decide not to keep an empty space for someone who had no use for it. In the afternoons I began to sit in that room with Max, a book in my lap, the sun warming my face. I placed a small plant on the windowsill, its green leaves bright against the pale winter light. I kept the quilt, but now it lay draped over my knees as I read. There were moments when I'd glance at the dresser or the closet and remember what had been there. The sound of her suitcase rolling across the floor, the way she'd toss her scarf onto the chair. The memories still pricked, but they no longer cut deep. One evening, I brewed tea and carried it into the room, sitting in the chair while Max chewed quietly on a bone. The room was warm, the lamp casting a soft glow. And I realized that for the first time in months, I felt a sense of belonging in my own home. She had taken her place in my life and moved it elsewhere. But in doing so, she had left behind a place I could now fill, not with her shadow but with my own light. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in weeks. And when I woke in the morning, I didn't check my phone for messages. I didn't wait for a knock at the door. I simply rose, made coffee, and greeted Max as he bounded into the kitchen. Something had shifted. I could feel it in the way my shoulders sat lower, in the way my breath moved easier. I hadn't let go entirely, I wasn't ready for that, but I had stopped clinging. The room was no longer hers. It was ours, mine and Max's. And in a way I hadn't expected, that felt like the first step towards something new. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. Once the room was no longer hers, I began to see the rest of the house differently. Not in a way that made me want to change the wallpaper or rearrange the furniture, but in a way that made me realize how many corners I had left untouched, because they still held traces of someone else's life. There was a drawer in the kitchen I hadn't opened in years, not because I'd forgotten it was there, but because it held things that didn't belong to me anymore. A stack of birthday cards I'd given her that she never took home. Old receipts from outings we once enjoyed together. A note she had left on the fridge one day when I was out. A quick, casual back later that at the time had meant nothing. I took it all out. I read through each piece slowly, as if giving them one last acknowledgement, and then I placed them in a box with her name on it. I taped it shut. Not angrily, not sadly, just firmly, the way you close a chapter you know you won't be rereading. The next day, I opened the cabinet in the hallway where I kept my important papers. The deed to the house, my social security documents, insurance papers, the will Walter and I had drawn up years ago. Some of it was out of date. Some of it had been left too long without my attention. I took my time sorting each stack at the kitchen table. The afternoon sun stretched across the floor, and Max lay nearby, his ears twitching at every rustle of paper. I felt no rush. This was not busy work. This was claiming back the parts of my life that had been left unattended, while I had been waiting for her to return to me. One folder held the letter from Walter's pension plan, the one that had kept me afloat after his passing. I traced my finger over his name, remembering the way he signed it on every card, every note. For a moment I could almost hear his voice telling me I had always been capable. It was strange how empowering it felt to simply know where everything was again. I made a list of contacts, the lawyer who had helped us years ago, the bank officer who knew me by name. I decided I would make appointments, even if only to be sure all my affairs were in order. There was no one pushing me to do this. No urgency, no looming crisis. But I realized that for too long, I had been living in a way that assumed she would take care of things if I couldn't. That assumption no longer felt safe. And in its place came a kind of resolve I hadn't felt in years. That weekend I called Evelyn, a friend from church who had been widowed around the same time I had. We met for coffee at the diner. I told her about the room, about Max's new place, about sorting through the house. She listened without interrupting, her eyes soft but her posture steady. "You're not losing yourself," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "You're finding the part you gave away." Her words stayed with me as I walked home later, Max trotting happily at my side. The street was lined with maples turning red and gold, their leaves falling in slow spirals. I thought about how trees let go every year, not because they want to, but because it's the only way to survive the winter. The following Monday, I visited the lawyer's office. We went over my will, my accounts, the deed to the house. I made sure everything was clear, simple, and entirely mine. There was a strange, quiet satisfaction in signing my name on each document, as if each stroke of the pen was a small reclaiming. When I returned home, I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea and looked around. The house felt different. Not just cleaner or tidier, but lighter. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't living in the shadow of someone else's choices. That night I opened a new notebook. On the first page I wrote 3 things. 1. No more waiting. 2. Keep what loves you back. 3. Leave the rest in the past. I didn't need to explain them to myself. They were not goals to achieve, just truths to remember. Over the next few days I kept moving through the house, Not in a rush but with a quiet determination. I donated clothes I hadn't worn in years. I cleared the pantry of foods I'd kept just in case she visited. I placed a vase of fresh flowers in the spare room, where Max now slept soundly each night. It wasn't about removing her from my life entirely. It was about removing the spaces where I had been keeping myself small, waiting for someone else to decide my worth. One evening, I found an old photograph in the back of a drawer. Me, Walter, and Claire when she was still a little girl, standing in front of the porch swing. I looked at our faces, the easy happiness there. I didn't cry. Instead, I slid the photograph into an envelope and placed it in the same box with the rest of her things. That chapter was written. And yet, I kept one photograph for myself. A picture of just me and Walter, taken on our anniversary. In it, he's looking at me like I'm the only person in the world. I placed it on my nightstand. A reminder not of loss, but of the love that had once filled this house to the brim. By the end of the week, I felt different inside. Not unhurt, the wound was still there, but less at the mercy of it. I wasn't waiting for her anymore. I was standing in my own life again, my feet steady, my hands busy with things that mattered to me. And for the first time in a long while, I believed that maybe, just maybe, I could build something new in the space she had left behind. It's a strange thing, how a wound in the present can tug at the threads of an older one. One you thought had healed long ago. In the weeks after I cleared the spare room, I began to dream of my mother. Not the mother I knew in her later years, frail and quiet, but the one from my girlhood, strong-voiced, brisk in her movements, with a way of filling a room without trying. I was 15 when she stopped speaking to me for nearly a year. It had started over something small, though I can't even recall the exact moment now. I think it was about a boy from church who walked me home one evening. My mother didn't like him, said he wasn't serious about life, that I was wasting my time. I said she didn't understand me. That was the first time I saw a look in her eyes I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but withdrawal. She didn't slam doors or shout. She simply began to speak to me less and less, until our words were reduced to instructions about chores, reminders about dinner. She still fed me, still kept my clothes clean, but the warmth was gone. I remember lying in bed at night, straining to hear her voice in the kitchen, wishing she'd open my door just to say good night. Back then I told myself it was my fault, that if I just tried harder, if I was better, she'd let me back into her good graces. So I worked harder around the house. I kept my room spotless. I spoke only when spoken to, but nothing changed. The distance held. It wasn't until my father, a quiet man who rarely involved himself in such matters, sat her down and asked her why she was treating me like a stranger, that she thawed. She never apologized. She never explained. One evening she simply started talking to me again, as if the silence had never happened. But I remembered. I carried that silence with me into adulthood, though I didn't realize it at the time. It taught me that affection could be withdrawn without warning. That love, even from the people meant to give it freely, could be conditional. When I married Walter, I made myself a promise. That I would never let a wall grow between me and my child. That no matter what happened, she would never doubt that I loved her, that she was mine. And for many years I kept that promise without effort. Claire was the center of my world. But standing in the quiet of my kitchen now, decades later, I recognized the familiar ache in my chest. The hollow where conversation used to be. The way you start to measure time not in days or months, but in the spaces between someone's visits, someone's calls. It was the same shape of wound. I remembered one afternoon from that long ago year with my mother. I had come home from school to find her in the garden, trimming back the roses. I stood on the porch wanting to ask if I could help, but my voice caught. I knew she wouldn't say yes. I knew she would tell me she didn't need me right then. That's what it feels like when you've been shut out. Even the simplest offers feel risky because you've learned how easily they can be declined. I think part of me had been bracing for Claire's withdrawal for years without naming it. I had noticed the small ways her life had grown around me rather than with me. The hesitations in her voice when I asked about visiting. The way she always seemed to have other plans. I told myself it was natural that children grow into their own lives. But there was a deeper instinct whispering that something more final was coming. And when she said those words, "You're not family anymore," it was as if both wounds overlapped in my chest. I was 15 again, standing on that porch watching my mother cut roses and wondering if she even knew I was there. But there was a difference now. At 15, I had no choice but to wait for my mother to come back to me. I had no power to set the terms, no ability to make my own life apart from hers. Now I was not that girl. I had my own home, my own means, my own choices. And though the ache was the same, the way I would carry it could be different. One afternoon, I took down a small wooden box from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were keepsakes from my childhood, a ribbon from my first school play, a postcard my father sent me when he went to visit family out west, a photograph of my mother and me taken before that long year of silence. I studied that photograph for a long time. In it, we were standing side by side, our hands nearly touching. She was smiling in that effortless way she had when she was in a good mood. I was looking up at her. I couldn't remember what we'd been doing that day. I couldn't even remember the sound of her laughter from that moment. But I knew it had been real, just as I knew the love I'd given Claire had been real too. That's the thing about love. It can be real and it can still end. And when it does, you have to decide what to do with the space it leaves. I put the photograph back in the box, closed the lid, and slid it back onto the shelf. Not to forget, but to keep it where it belonged. The wound my mother left had shaped me in ways I only understood now. It had taught me to survive silence. It had taught me that when someone closes a door on you, you don't have to stand on the porch forever. You can turn, walk down the steps, and find somewhere else to go. And this time I would. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because the grocery store was quiet, and the air outside still carried that heavy gray stillness after a morning rain. I had gone into town for milk, flour, and a few apples for pie. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was at the checkout when I saw it. Not in person, in a photograph, glowing from the phone screen of the woman in line ahead of me. She was scrolling through pictures, her thumb stopping on one that caught my eye. It was my daughter, standing at the head of a long dining table, surrounded by cousins and a few faces I didn't know. The table was set for Thanksgiving. The sight caught in my throat. I leaned just enough to be sure. There was the roast turkey, the pies, the cranberry sauce. There was Claire, her smile wide and easy, her arms slung around a woman I didn't recognize. A woman who stood where I had always stood, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I looked away quickly, not wanting to be the kind of person who peers into another's phone. But the image was already burned into my mind. When I got home, I put the groceries away without thought. My hands moved on their own, placing items in the pantry, milk in the fridge. My mind was still at that table, the table I had once set year after year. I tried to tell myself it might not have been Thanksgiving. Maybe it was another gathering, maybe the timing was different. But later that evening, while scrolling through the news on my own phone, I saw it again. This time it was posted by a cousin, with the caption, "Another perfect family Thanksgiving. Another perfect family." The photographs were crisp and warm. Claire at the stove basting the turkey. Laughter caught midair as they clinked glasses. Children playing on the floor in the background. And that same woman, standing so close to Claire they might have been sisters, leaning in as if she had known her all her life. I studied each picture until the edges blurred. My chest felt tight, my pulse loud in my ears. It wasn't just that I hadn't been invited. It was that no one seemed to notice I wasn't there. No one's eyes searched the room for me. No one saved me a seat. The comments below the post were full of warm words, heart emojis, blessings for family. And each one felt like a small weight pressing further into my ribs. I closed the phone and set it face down on the table. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock and the soft shift of Max moving from one side of the rug to the other. It wasn't the first time I'd been left out of something. Over the past few years, there had been birthday dinners I wasn't invited to, casual Sunday brunches I only learned about afterward. But Thanksgiving, that had always been ours. The one holiday that no matter where life had taken us, we found our way back to the same table. And now that table belonged to someone else. I walked to the spare room, our room now, Max's and mine, and sat down in the chair by the window. The late afternoon light fell in soft, fading stripes across the floor. I rested my hands in my lap and let the weight of it settle. This was not just distance. This was replacement. In that moment, a memory rose unbidden. The first Thanksgiving after Walter died. I had been terrified of the empty space his absence would leave. But Claire had taken my hand, told me we'd make it through together. We'd cooked all day, just the two of us, and by the time we sat down to eat, I had felt something close to peace. That was the day I had realized that even when you lose someone, traditions can anchor you. They can keep you from floating away in grief. And now someone else was holding the anchor. I didn't cry right away. I sat there feeling the slow, deep ache spread through me, a kind of heaviness that made even breathing feel deliberate. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was something colder, a recognition that I was no longer part of her picture, even in moments that had once defined us. Later that night, while making tea, I thought about calling her. I thought about asking, not accusing, just asking why she hadn't invited me. But I knew the answer would be wrapped in polite excuses. Too far to travel. Thought you'd be tired. Didn't want you to feel pressured. Words meant to soften the truth, but unable to change it. So I didn't call. Instead, I poured the tea, carried it to the spare room, and sat in the quiet. Max lay at my feet, his eyes half closed, content simply because I was there. I envied his simplicity, his lack of questions. The truth sat between us like an unspoken thing. I had been replaced, and she had done it so seamlessly that the rest of the family had followed along without protest. I sipped the tea slowly, each swallow steadying me a little more. This was the lowest point, I knew. Not because of the exclusion alone, but because of the clarity it brought. The clarity was this: I could not go back to waiting. Waiting for an invitation. Waiting for a call. Waiting for proof that I still belonged. That wait would never end in the way I wanted. Some part of me had already started to turn away, even as my heart ached. I thought of the notebook on my nightstand, the 3 truths I'd written in my own hand. They seemed more urgent now than ever. No more waiting. Keep what loves you back. Leave the rest in the past. The tea grew cold in my hands, but I stayed there until the room was dark. After that night, something inside me went still. Not frozen, just still, like a pond after the wind has died. The ache was still there, but it no longer drove me to check my phone or stand by the window at certain hours, hoping to see her car turn into the driveway. The first change I made was so small, I doubt anyone would have noticed. I stopped answering the phone right away when she called. Not out of pettiness, but because I realized I didn't need to be at her beck and call anymore. If I was in the middle of folding laundry, I finished the load before I picked up. If I was reading, I read to the end of the chapter. It sounds simple, but for years I had been ready to drop whatever I was doing just to make sure she felt heard. I began filling my days more intentionally. Mornings were for walks with Max, our steps slow but steady down the tree-lined streets. We greeted the mailman, watched the squirrels chase each other in the park. Sometimes we'd stop at the little cafe near the post office, where the waitress knew I liked my coffee with extra cream and a side of buttered toast. Afternoons became quieter, but not lonely. I read more old books I'd meant to return to for years. I started a small vegetable garden behind the house, though it was late in the season. Just a few rows of lettuce and carrots, but it felt good to put my hands in the dirt, to watch something grow because I tended to it, not because I was waiting for someone else to notice. When invitations came for gatherings where I knew she would be, I weighed them carefully. Not out of fear, but out of self-preservation. I realized that I didn't have to place myself in spaces where my worth would be measured against someone else's presence. And so, more often than not, I politely declined. "Thank you," I'd say, "but I think I'll stay home this time." There's a certain strength in absence, in choosing not to walk into rooms that drain you. I also began to take small steps to protect my heart. I muted her posts online, not to punish her, but to keep myself from staring at photographs that would reopen wounds. I unsubscribed from the little family group messages where my name had slowly been mentioned less and less. In their place, I found new rhythms. I joined a small knitting circle at the library on Thursday afternoons. The women there talked about everything from books to the weather to the stubbornness of tomato plants. They didn't know my history. They didn't measure my worth by who I belonged to. They simply welcomed me because I was there. At first, I felt guilty for enjoying these hours, as if by finding contentment outside of her, I was betraying some unspoken rule of motherhood. But with each passing week, that guilt faded, replaced by something steadier: relief. The spare room, our room, became more and more a part of my daily life. Some afternoons, I'd open the window and let the breeze carry in the scent of the pine tree out front. I kept a small basket there with books, a blanket, and Max's favorite toys. It was a place for resting, not waiting. One evening in early winter, I was invited to a neighbor's home for dinner. I almost said no out of habit. The pull of my quiet routine was strong. But something in me said to go. It was a small gathering. Just 4 of us around a table set with simple food and candles. We talked, we laughed, and when I walked home later the air was crisp, my cheeks pink from both the cold and the warmth of the company. That night, as I sat in my chair with a cup of tea, I realized I hadn't thought about her for hours. It wasn't that I didn't love her anymore. It was that my love no longer demanded her constant presence to feel whole. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the difference in my breathing slower, deeper. The house felt less like a stage waiting for the main character to return, and more like a lived-in home. I still thought of her, of course. Sometimes I'd remember her as a little girl, her hair tangled from sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of milk. Sometimes I'd think of her laugh, sharp and sudden, the way it used to fill a room. But I let those memories be just that, memories. I didn't try to use them as currency to buy my way back into her life. The truth I had learned was simple. I could keep loving her from a distance, without placing myself where I wasn't wanted. I could care without chasing. I could remember without aching. And in that quiet shift, I began to understand something I wish I'd learned sooner. Sometimes the most powerful way to protect your heart is not by building walls, but by stepping away from the places where it's been broken too many times. By winter's first snow, the shift had settled into me like a second skin. I no longer felt the tug to explain myself, to justify my absence, or to hope for invitations that might never come. I was living my life, not waiting for permission to begin it. Max seemed to sense it too. He followed me from room to room, not with the anxious energy of before, but with a calm that matched my own. And in the evenings when we sat together in the spare room, I knew that this steady, quiet companionship was enough. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in late January, the kind where the light is pale and the house feels like it's holding its breath. Snow had fallen overnight, softening the edges of the world. From the kitchen window, I could see the branches of the maple tree bowing under the weight of it. I was sorting through an old cedar chest in my bedroom, one I hadn't opened in years. It held all the keepsakes that never seemed to belong anywhere else. Folded quilts, a bundle of letters tied with string, a box of photographs whose corners had begun to curl. Max was stretched out on the rug, his head resting on his paws, watching me with those patient brown eyes that never asked for more than my presence. I untied the string around the letters, thinking they were all from old friends or church members. But in the middle of the stack was an envelope with Walter's handwriting. It was dated the year before he passed. I don't know why I'd never opened it. Perhaps I'd tucked it away, saving it for a day when I thought I'd need it most. Maybe that day had finally come. The paper was soft from age, the ink slightly faded. His handwriting, steady and strong, moved across the page in familiar loops. He wrote about ordinary things, the tomatoes in the garden, the way the porch swing needed oiling, but near the end there was a line that stopped me. If you ever feel alone after I'm gone, I want you to remember this. You've always been the strongest person I know. You won't think so, but you are. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise, not even yourself. I read it twice, 3 times, the words sinking into the spaces I'd been keeping hidden. Strongest person I know. It was strange how those words felt heavier now than they might have back then. Back then I didn't question my place in anyone's life. Now they felt like an anchor. I placed the letter back in the envelope, but I didn't put it away. Instead, I set it on my nightstand where I could see it each morning. That night, I sat in the spare room with Max curled against my legs. I read the letter aloud, my voice quiet, steady. He tilted his head as if listening, his tail thumping gently against the floor. When I finished, I rested my hand on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. In that moment, I realized that my truest allies were not the ones who could be swayed by time or circumstance. They were the ones whose loyalty was constant. My late husband's belief in me, my dog's unchanging devotion, and though it was still fragile, my own growing trust in myself. From then on, the letter became part of my morning ritual. After making coffee, I'd sit in the chair by the window and read that one line again. You've always been the strongest person I know. Some mornings I believed it more than others, but I read it every day just the same. Strength didn't have to mean loudness. I wasn't going to march into her life and demand a place. I wasn't going to make speeches about the pain she'd caused. My strength would be quieter, The kind that comes from standing where you are and refusing to be moved by someone else's storms. The more I leaned into that quiet strength, the more I began to see where it could take me. I started making small plans. In the spring, I would plant more vegetables. I would join the senior walking group at the park. I might even take that bus trip to the coast I've been putting off for years. It wasn't about distraction. It was about building a life that didn't rely on the approval or inclusion of someone who had shown me she could live without me. Max became my daily reminder of what love without condition looked like. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't keep score. When I was sad, he pressed himself closer. When I laughed, his ears perked up. And every morning without fail, he greeted me as though I were the best thing that had ever happened to him. One evening I took him for a walk just as the sun was setting, the snow underfoot crunching with each step. The air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but the sky was painted in pinks and golds that made it worth staying out a little longer. I thought about how much had changed in the past months, not in her life but in mine. I was no longer waiting for her to pull me back in. I was no longer checking my phone with that quiet desperation. The absence was still there, but it didn't define the day anymore. When we returned home, I lit a candle in the kitchen, brewed tea, and opened my notebook. I wrote down Walter's words in large, steady letters. Strongest person I know. And beneath it, I added my own. I believe him. It wasn't a declaration for anyone else to read. It wasn't proof. It was just a truth I was learning to carry, the way you carry a stone in your pocket, small, solid, always there to remind you of its weight. By the time I went to bed that night, I knew something had shifted again. The hurt was still part of me, but it no longer felt like the center. The center now was made of something else: memory, loyalty, and the quiet certainty that I could stand even here, even now. Have you ever found strength in moments of silence? Let me know. It was late February when the first call came. I saw her name on the screen while I was stirring soup on the stove. For a moment my old instinct flared, that familiar urge to drop everything and answer. But I let the phone ring twice before I picked it up. Her voice was lighter than I expected, though there was something underneath it, a slight tremor she couldn't quite hide. She asked how I'd been, her tone brisk, as if we were acquaintances catching up rather than a mother and daughter with months of distance between them. I told her I was well, that Max and I had been keeping busy. I didn't ask her the same. It wasn't until the end of the call that she mentioned it. She needed someone to keep an eye on her apartment for a week, while she was out of town for work. She said it quickly, like a footnote, and I could hear in her voice that she expected me to agree without hesitation. Years ago I would have, but now I simply told her I couldn't. I didn't explain that I had my own plans that week. A meeting at the library, a dinner with Evelyn, the beginnings of my spring garden to tend. I didn't offer to reschedule. I just said, I'm not able to this time. There was a pause. She said she understood, but her tone carried the faintest edge of surprise. Then she said she'd figure something else out, and the call ended. Afterward, I stood by the kitchen window, watching the steam from the soup curl upward. It wasn't revenge that kept me from helping. It was simply the truth. I had learned that my time, my energy, were not inexhaustible resources to be tapped whenever it suited someone else. A week later, another call. This time her voice was different, smaller somehow. She told me she'd been sick for a few days, some kind of flu that had kept her in bed. She didn't ask me to come, but I could hear the unspoken wish in the way she lingered on her words. I listened, offered her the same kindness I would anyone else, but I didn't leap to fill the silence with offers. When we hung up, I made a note to myself to send her some broth by delivery the next morning. It struck me then that this was the shift I hadn't realized I'd been working toward. The ability to care without surrendering myself in the process. By March, the snow had melted into patches, and the first shoots of green began to push through the garden bed. I was kneeling there one afternoon, pulling away the dead leaves, when Evelyn stopped by. She told me she'd seen my daughter in town the day before, looking tired, distracted. She asked how you were, Evelyn said. I told her you seemed well. The fact that she'd asked didn't stir hope in me the way it once would have. Instead, it settled over me like a neutral truth. Neither a promise nor a threat, just a fact. That month there were more small signs. A text from her asking about a recipe. A short email with a photograph of a place we'd visited years ago. No note attached. Each time I responded simply without stepping beyond what was offered. In the past, I might have taken these crumbs as an invitation to rush back in, to re-establish the closeness I'd been craving. Now I saw them for what they were. The faint beginnings of her realizing that I was not always going to be there at the exact moment she wanted me. I did not wish her hardship. I did not wish her to feel the kind of loneliness I had felt. But there was a quiet justice in knowing that she might now be brushing against the edges of the absence she had created. The real change, though, was in me. The sight of her name on my phone no longer made my heart race in hope or dread. I could answer or not answer. I could give or withhold, and neither choice would undo me. One Saturday in early April she called again. This time she asked if she could come by. I told her I was heading out to meet friends but that she was welcome another day. She hesitated before saying, "All right, maybe next week." When I hung up, I sat for a moment in the quiet. There was a time when I would have canceled my plans, eager to seize any opportunity to see her. But now I understood that my life could not be built around the unpredictable tides of her presence. Max patted over, resting his head on my knee, and I scratched behind his ears. Outside, the sun was slipping lower, casting the house in a warm glow. I thought of Walter's letter on my nightstand, the way his words had begun to take root in me. Strongest person I know. Not the loudest. Not the one who wins every battle. Just the one who endures, who stands, who does not let the loss of one person erase the fullness of their own life. By the time the daffodils bloomed, I had reached a place I hadn't thought possible months before. I could see her, speak to her, even help her if I chose, without stepping back into the role of someone whose worth depended on her approval. And though she might never say it, I suspected she was beginning to see the difference too. It was late April when she finally came by. No phone call first, no text. Just the sound of a car pulling into the driveway while I was pruning the hydrangeas out front. The sun was warm, and a light breeze carried the scent of fresh soil. She stepped out of her car slowly, almost cautiously, as if unsure of the welcome she would receive. Her hands were empty, her coat unbuttoned despite the mild chill in the air. I straightened, brushing dirt from my gloves, and waited. She walked toward me, her steps small, measured. For a moment we simply looked at each other. "I wanted to talk," she said finally. I nodded, gesturing toward the porch. "All right." We sat on the swing Walter had built so many years ago, the chains creaking softly as we settled in. Max lay at my feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes tracking the movement of her hands in her lap. She began with small talk, how work had been, how the weather was changing, a mention of the flowers starting to bloom along Main Street. I listened, nodding now and then, but I could feel something heavier in her pauses. Eventually it came. "I know I've been distant," she said, her eyes on the floorboards of the porch. I don't know. Things have been complicated." I waited. There was a time I would have rushed in to fill that silence, to reassure her, to offer her a way out of the discomfort. But I didn't this time. I let the pause stretch until she lifted her eyes to meet mine. "I miss how things used to be," she said. It was then that I spoke. My voice was calm, steady, the way you speak when you've practiced the truth in your own head long enough that you no longer fear how it will land. "I miss them too," I said. "But I've learned something these past months. I can't build my life around waiting for someone to come back to me. I won't do it anymore." She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand gently. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because it's the truth. I love you, I always will. But my worth isn't measured by where I stand in your life. It's mine to keep, whether you see it or not." She blinked, her lips pressing together. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I said. "I believe that. But meaning and impact aren't the same thing. And the impact has been hard. I've had to learn how to fill my days without waiting for your call. How to keep my heart open without leaving it at the door for you to pick up when you feel like it." For a long moment we both just listened to the sound of the chains creaking, the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. "I'm not closing the door," I added. "I'm just not leaving it propped open anymore. If you want to come in, you'll have to knock, and I'll decide when or if I answer. That's not punishment. That's me taking care of myself." Her gaze dropped again, and I could see her jaw tighten. Not with anger, more like realization. "I understand," she said quietly, though her voice wavered. I hope you do, I replied. Because I'm not going to beg for my place anymore. I've done enough of that in my life, and I've learned it only leaves you tired and small. I've made my peace with the fact that family is not just blood. It's who shows up. And I will keep my life filled with people and beings, I added, glancing at Max, who stay. For the first time in months she smiled, faintly but real. It didn't erase the hurt or the distance, but it was something. We sat there a while longer, not saying much. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass. The sun slipped behind a cloud, and the light softened. When she finally stood, she hesitated before stepping off the porch. "Thank you for saying that," she murmured. I nodded. "Take care of yourself." She got into her car and drove away, and I stayed on the porch watching the dust settle in her wake. My heart was steady. There was no surge of hope, no ache of longing. Just a quiet certainty that I had spoken the truth, and that speaking it had left me lighter. Inside, I made a pot of tea and carried it into the spare room. Max followed, curling up at my feet. I reached for Walter's letter on the nightstand and read that one line again. "Strongest person I know." That evening, as the sky turned dusky blue, I realized I no longer felt like someone on the outside of her own life. I was living inside it again. Fully wholly, and no one could take that from me. The days that followed were steady, almost gentle. I didn't replay the conversation with Claire over and over the way I might have months ago. There was no searching for hidden meaning in her words. No lingering on what she might do next. I had said what I needed to say, and that was enough. The air was warming, the garden beginning to show color again. I planted marigolds along the path to the porch, their bright petals like small suns against the fresh green. In the mornings, I'd sit on the swing with a cup of coffee, listening to the robins chatter in the maple tree. Max would wander the yard, his nose to the ground, his tail swaying lazily. I found myself making plans without thinking about whether she might join. A Saturday trip to the farmer's market with Evelyn. A Tuesday afternoon of baking bread for the church social. Evenings spent reading by the open window, the cool spring breeze carrying in the scent of lilacs. It was a quiet kind of joy. Not the sharp thrill of something new, but the deep, steady contentment of knowing you belong fully in your own days. One afternoon, I decided to host a small gathering at my home. Nothing grand, just a handful of neighbors, a couple of friends from church, Evelyn, and her brother who was visiting from out of state. I baked pies, roasted chicken, and set the table with the quilted placemats Walter's mother had made decades ago. As the house filled with voices and the smell of good food, I caught myself smiling without effort. The laughter was easy, the conversation unhurried. No one here was measuring my worth by where I stood in a family tree. They were here because they wanted to be, and that, I realized, was more than enough. At one point in the evening, Evelyn leaned over and said, "You seem lighter." "I am," I said, and I meant it. After the guests left, I stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen. The counters cluttered with plates and glasses, the floor scattered with crumbs. Max was already curled up in the spare room, his bed pulled close to the chair where I often sat. I didn't feel the need to clean up right away. Instead, I let the warmth of the evening linger in the air. Over the next weeks, I kept building my life outward. I joined the walking group at the park, started a small weekly letter to an old friend in Oregon, and even signed up for a bus trip to the coast in June. The thought of traveling without Claire didn't bring sadness anymore, just a sense of possibility. The spare room had fully transformed. The quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed, but now it was used often, on cool evenings when I read, or when a friend stayed overnight. A vase of fresh flowers sat on the windowsill, and Max's bed had pride of place by the chair. It no longer felt like a monument to absence. It felt lived in, warm, and entirely mine. Sometimes I would think of Claire, of course. I would wonder if she was well, if she was finding her own peace. And if she called or sent a short message, I responded kindly. But I didn't lean into those moments the way I used to. I let them be just that, moments, not lifelines. One evening in early summer, I took a walk just as the sun was setting. The sky was awash with gold and rose, the air soft and warm. I thought of how far I had come since that autumn day when she told me I was not family anymore. How I had taken those words, let them hurt, let them teach me, and then let them go. I realized then that I no longer felt defined by what she had said or done. My life was no longer a story about loss. It was a story about reclamation. When I returned home, I sat on the porch swing, Max at my side, and looked at the little house I had kept for so many years. The white paint was weathered, the porch sagged just a little more, but it was still standing, and so was I. That night, I lit a candle in the kitchen, poured myself a cup of tea, and opened my notebook. I turned to the page where I had written my 3 truths months ago. 1. No more waiting. 2. Keep what loves you back. 3. Leave the rest in the past. I traced my finger over the words, knowing they had become more than just reminders. They had become the way I lived. The next morning I woke with the sun, the house filled with the smell of coffee, the sound of birdsong spilling through the open windows. My life was not the same as it had been before, but it was mine. Entirely, quietly, joyfully mine. I've learned something in these months, something I wish I had known years ago. I've learned something in these months, something I wish I had known years ago. When someone you love turns away, it feels at first like the world has shrunk, like the air has gone thin, and you must learn to breathe all over again. But over time you realize the world hasn't grown smaller, only different. And there is room in it for you, even without the people you once thought you couldn't live without. I still love my daughter. That hasn't changed, and it probably never will. But I no longer wait for her to decide my place. I've planted my own roots again, here in this little house, with the garden out front and Max at my side. The spare room tells the story better than I can. Once a place of waiting, now a place of living. It's where I read, where friends stay, where Max sleeps peacefully each night. It no longer holds the echo of what I've lost, but the warmth of what I've kept. Some days I still feel the ache. I imagine I always will. But the ache no longer decides how my day will go. It's just one note in a larger song. A song I get to write, one quiet verse at a time. If you've ever felt forgotten, cast aside, or told you don't belong, I hope you remember this. Your worth does not live in someone else's keeping. It's yours, and it always has been. You can tend to it the way you tend to a garden, a little care each day, pulling out the weeds, planting what you want to see grow. And one day, you'll look around and realize you are standing in the middle of something beautiful you built for yourself. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. When someone you love turns away, it feels at first like the world has shrunk, like the air has gone thin, and you must learn to breathe all over again. But over time you realize the world hasn't grown smaller, only different. And there is room in it for you, even without the people you once thought you couldn't live without. I still love my daughter. That hasn't changed, and it probably never will. But I no longer wait for her to decide my place. I've planted my own roots again, here in this little house, with the garden out front and Max at my side. The spare room tells the story better than I can. Once a place of waiting, now a place of living. It's where I read, where friends stay, where Max sleeps peacefully each night. It no longer holds the echo of what I've lost, but the warmth of what I've kept. Some days I still feel the ache. I imagine I always will. But the ache no longer decides how my day will go. It's just one note in a larger song. A song I get to write, one quiet verse at a time. If you've ever felt forgotten, cast aside, or told you don't belong, I hope you remember this. Your worth does not live in someone else's keeping. It's yours, and it always has been. You can tend to it the way you tend to a garden, a little care each day, pulling out the weeds, planting what you want to see grow. And one day, you'll look around and realize you are standing in the middle of something beautiful you built for yourself. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. I've learned something in these months, something I wish I had known years ago. When someone you love turns away, it feels at first like the world has shrunk, like the air has gone thin, and you must learn to breathe all over again. But over time you realize the world hasn't grown smaller, only different. And there is room in it for you, even without the people you once thought you couldn't live without. I still love my daughter. That hasn't changed, and it probably never will. But I no longer wait for her to decide my place. I've planted my own roots again, here in this little house, with the garden out front and Max at my side. The spare room tells the story better than I can. Once a place of waiting, now a place of living. It's where I read, where friends stay, where Max sleeps peacefully each night. It no longer holds the echo of what I've lost, but the warmth of what I've kept. Some days I still feel the ache. I imagine I always will. But the ache no longer decides how my day will go. It's just one note in a larger song. A song I get to write, one quiet verse at a time. If you've ever felt forgotten, cast aside, or told you don't belong, I hope you remember this. Your worth does not live in someone else's keeping. It's yours, and it always has been. You can tend to it the way you tend to a garden, a little care each day, pulling out the weeds, planting what you want to see grow. And one day, you'll look around and realize you are standing in the middle of something beautiful you built for yourself. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments that I've learned something in these months. Something I wish I had known years ago. When someone you love turns away, it feels at first like the world has shrunk, like the air has gone thin, and you must learn to breathe all over again. But over time you realize the world hasn't grown smaller, only different. And there is room in it for you, even without the people you once thought you couldn't live without. I still love my daughter. That hasn't changed, and it probably never will. But I no longer wait for her to decide my place. I've planted my own roots again. Here in this little house, with the garden out front and Max at my side. The spare room tells the story better than I can. Once a place of waiting, now a place of living. It's where I read, where friends stay, where Max sleeps peacefully each night. It no longer holds the echo of what I've lost, but the warmth of what I've kept. Some days I still feel the ache. I imagine I always will. But the ache no longer decides how my day will go. It's just one note in a larger song. A song I get to write, one quiet verse at a time. If you've ever felt forgotten, cast aside, or told you don't belong, I hope you remember this. Your worth does not live in someone else's keeping. It's yours, and it always has been. You can tend to it the way you tend to a garden, a little care each day, pulling out the weeds, planting what you want to see grow. And one day, you'll look around and realize you are standing in the middle of something beautiful you built for yourself. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments.